Welcome back to our class on Basar B'Chalav. We are continuing in our learning of the laws of distancing meat and milk from each other. We are continuing with Siman Tzadi Aleph 91. We are discussing new topic, which is to not have things touch each other and not have them come in contact with hot foods. The official title of the Siman is the laws of Basar B'Chalav that are mixed, but this isn't all going to be a mixture necessarily, because we're going to start off talking about cold. So let's talk about cold things when they're cold. So the Shulchan Aruch starts off over here. The Chaber writes the following. He says in Siman Tzadi Aleph, Seif Aleph, chapter 91, halacha number 1, Basar ugvina shenaga'u zeh b'zeh mutarim. You have meat and you have cheese, and they touch each other. They are permitted. Ele shetzarich lahadiach makom negiyasan. It's just that you have to go ahead and wash off the spot where they came in contact. Zogtayit. It says muter latzur osam v'matpachas achas. Lo chayshinan shema yigu zeh b'zeh. It's also permitted to tie them together in the same sack or satchel. And as long as we're not concerned, as long as we know that they're not going to be touching one another, right? We're not concerned about that. Okay, so it probably doesn't mean a bag where they're bouncing around in it. The idea is that they kind of stay in their place in the bag and aren't going to touch each other. So let's go through the source material of this halacha of the Shulchan Aruch and see how it develops to this language that we see right here. So this starts off with a Mishnah in Chulin. This is on Kuf Zayin Amud Beis. And guess what it says in the Mishnah? You can take meat and you can take cheese and you can put them in a bag, right? The same sack, as long as they are not touching each other. Okay, so the Mishnah says that you can tie them together in the bag as long as they're not touching. The Gemara says, all right, let's say they're touching each other. Right? That's just a simple question. Let's say they're touching. So the Gemara says, I should object to that being an issue because they're both cold. It's cold to cold. Sonain but sonain. So the word sonain means cold. We're going to use the word sonain a lot because that's just, it's just an important word to use in here, like basar, like chalav, like vina. It's another vocab word. Sonain will be used a lot going forward. So I'll continue to reinforce that word as we go forward. So Abaye answers the question. Says, even though it doesn't need to be peeled when they touch each other, right? You don't have to actually take anything off of it. It nonetheless needs to be rinsed. So the Chiddush of the Mishnah, the novel rule that it's teaching us is that cold meat and cold cheese that get a little too comfortable with each other need to go get washed. Okay? So that's the big thing. Now, another important Gemara to know about is Gemara in Pesachim. It's actually a Brisa. And this Brisa makes a list of what happens when you have hot and cold touching each other. So this Brisa says the following. It says on Pesachim, Ayin Vav Amud Aleph, it's 76a. It's actually talking about the laws of the Korban Pesach, which is important because that also can come in contact with certain things. It has to be roasted over fire, the Paschal offering, the Pesach sacrifice. So knowing what it comes in contact with would determine what type of heat is causing changes in that meat. So that's why those laws are pertinent over there as well. So one of the things it points out is cham l'toich kole. So if you have a hot thing and it goes into a cold thing, you have to just peel the bottom. That's what kolef means. All right, just so kolef means to peel it. It's a very small amount. Okay, we'll go into more detail about what kedei klipa is and all that stuff at another time. Just know that should suffice for our knowledge at this point. So if cold falls on the cold, you give them a scrub. Okay? So we're talking about meat falling into milk or some type of other impermissible mixtures of some kind. Okay, so all those things are all considered covered under the language of this brisa. So we see over here that doing these things is not that big a deal. Okay? So the Torah brings this down, and he says, Basar, that meat and cheese, the gavina, right? They touch each other, fine. They just have to be rinsed off if they touch each other. And it's also permitted to put them in the same bag. And we're not worried about them touching them in the bag, right? So if you keep them away, that's fine. That's what the Torah brings us down. Okay? So what's interesting is before we even get to the main halacha, Rabbi Akiva Eiger has an issue almost immediately in this halacha about the Torah. So he says that the idea of allowing things come in contact and then rinsing them off seems to be a machlekes rishonim. In the Torah Sabayis of the Rashba, we've mentioned this work several times. There's a work on kashrus called the Torah Sabayis, the laws of the household, and the Rashba and the Ra argue about rinsing things off. So the issue they have is that they're not sure if meat that when we talk about it in the Gemara is talking about raw meat or cooked meat. The Rashba seems to talk about this halacha in the following way, that since we normally rinse off raw meat, so things coming in contact with each other will be permitted. Okay? And another thing is that we also make differentiations between fatty meat and lean meat. So if the meat has a little bit of fat on it, fat tends to be, was always in the fridge where it's really firm. It's room temperature, so it's kind of sticky, right? So that might be a little more difficult if it comes in contact with some dairy. So he also seems to say that that's also not that big a deal, okay? So they were also going to be rinsed off. So we're assuming that all types of raw meat are rinsed off. He says that doesn't apply to when we're cutting it with knives, because knives aren't really rinsed off so well. So he has an interesting opinion in which he's stating that certain things are regularly rinsed off and certain things are not regularly rinsed off. The Aaron Alevi, he has a commentary, the Mishmeres of the Beta Kabayas, where he makes some comments on that. He says, he's like, I don't think you can rely on this idea of if it's not really sticky that I don't have to rinse it. He says it doesn't matter what the type of meat it is. If it's cooked, if it's lean or whatever, you can't have it touch the cheese, even if you're going to rinse it. Maybe you're not going to rinse it. So he doesn't really agree with this interpretation of the Rashba. The Pri Megadim also takes note of this, and he asks a similar question. He says, we're not clear in the Gemara that we're talking about different types of meat. So I should think that even raw meat, and even if there's no fat that's extra sticky on it, shouldn't make a difference. You would still have to rinse it off. And the Pri Megadim even argues that you have to actually scrub it pretty vigorously if it was more fatty and a little bit more sticky, because you have to make sure that everything comes off. We're not quite sure what is transferring yet. We'll come back to that. We're just assuming there is something transferring. We're not defining that yet. Just assume for a second that something is transferring and it needs scrubbing. And so the Piskei Tshuva makes note of this Pri Megadim as well, as to whether or not this idea of I will rinse it, I won't rinse it, it's normal to rinse it, is something that we should take into consideration. So other people disagree with the Pri Megadim and it's Rabbi Akiva Eiger, and that you don't really need vigorous scrubbing, you just need a slight rinse, and that we also don't seem to have anything that seems to point to there being different types of meat, if they're fatty or lean, needing different levels of scrubbing, or whether or not there'd be more permission to have one come in contact with cheese or not. So that question is actually further developed by the Bach over here as well. The Bach is really important over here because it's really the first thing he looks at it. He says, the Gemara's question of, even if they do touch each other, what's the big deal? He seems to take from that an assumption that not everything that comes into contact with each other should transfer. So the Bach has an interesting chiddush. He has a novel idea that maybe if they're both really dry, there's no transfer at all, and no rinsing or scrubbing is necessary. And the Shach in Sifkat Nalef, the first Shach over there, he agrees with this argument of the Bach that they're really dry. You don't need to worry about it. So the Pri Megadim, he takes issue with this. So he doesn't seem to agree that this is the way to learn the Gemara at all, or even to understand the question in this way. He doesn't feel like this is moving the Gemara's question. The Gemara's question is much more basic. He seems to feel, the Pri Megadim does, that there is a response to the question of Abaye saying we're talking about rinsing it off. So, and it's entirely possible that the person asking the question was unaware of the brisa that we talk about that says that in the cold, they get scrubbed. right? And that's what Rabbi is coming to teach them. Is that would be the case. So there's no reason to make this distinction either. So at this point, we're not making any distinctions about any type of meat, even though we see some potential for that in the Rashba, and we see some potential for that in the Bach. So the Shach likes the Bach. So the whole problem is that no one else seems to take on the leniency of the Bach. So the Pre-Toar looks at it and he says, well, what if it's sharp? Is sharp maybe more sticky and things will stick to it? Or is it considered like it's wet? So he seems to learn that being sharp is like an onion or a horseradish. When you slice open the spot and you come in contact with something, that other stuff will stick to it. So if you slice an onion and it lands on a piece of steak, right, you're going to have particles transferring to it. Okay, and the Pri Megadim and Chavas Das make this argument as well. That even with dry cheese, the Pre-Toar also continues to say that little tiny crumbs can come off, and this is also echoed by the Kaf HaChaim, to say that little particles could also be coming off. And so basically, what we come down to is there doesn't seem to be any real reason to rely on this opinion of the Bach, because you could be concerned about other little things that aren't mentioned one way or the other in the Gemara. So it doesn't seem to be that way. And the Chavas Das also adds, he says that if it's salted meat, then it should be considered wet, just like sharp things should be considered wet. And so we can't really rely on this Bach for a whole lot of things. The Yad Yehuda makes an interesting point about what happens if you have like meaty salt, like you had salt that had meat fall in it and absorb some meat flavor. So that should be something that you have to wash off as well. Okay, so that seems to be the deal. So we keep talking about washing it off, and we mentioned different types of washing. So what do the Achronim say is the washing? Because how to wash it, how to scrub it, is not explicitly explained in the Gemara itself. So the Pre-Toar and seems to say the idea that rinsing it means that you simply run it under water and there's no additional scrubbing required. Okay, that is how he argues it. The Chavas Das says the difference between when you cut something with a knife, okay, and you leave something very fatty on there, okay, versus things that kind of come in contact with each other. So he says that you really need to make sure that you get all the particles off. So technically, we should be telling people that when things adhere more intensely, they need a deeper scrub or deeper clean, and when they're not sticking so much, they just require a light rinsing. Okay, and that difference would be if there's something that has some fat attached to it, if something fatty or liquidy that becomes more attached. There is more. There's more to say on this, and they bring up the Rashba again, who says that by fatty stuff it needs to be scrubbed a little more intently, and so therefore a lot of Achronim continue to make the argument that you need to kind of use your judgment, that if stuff looks like it's a little bit more fatty or so on, you have to scrub it more vigorously. They also make an argument that if it's butter that's melted is different than if it's butter that's solid, and also if it's fat that has been rendered and it's going to be a little bit more on the clear side, and then it'll stick to it a little bit more. It'll need more additional scrubbing. So you have to use your judgment to make sure it all gets off of there. Okay? And we're going to learn more about this when we talk about cutting cucumbers. That'll be in Siman Tzadi Vav's Ifhei. So there we talk about another thing called greda, which is to scrub it. Both seem to be used in similarly that way. Mishnah Berurah, this is in Siman Shin Chav Gimel, and Sifkat and Lamed Vav. He says that if you have a treif knife in that case, and you want to cut meat with it, you want to have a treif knife and you want to cut bread with it, you still would have to scrub off that spot where you make the cut with it, okay? And that seems to be the way to do it, but he still can't do this on Shabbos because it looks like you're fixing it. So he also recommends that maybe you make that cut and then just cut another piece where you can technically eat the other side. So that's how the Mishnah Berurah kind of resolves the problem when you have a dirty knife when it comes to Shabbos. So there are people who disagree with the Mishnah Berurah. The Minchas Shabbos, Sefer Minchas Shabbos, it's a commentary on the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Doesn't agree, and he says you can go ahead and fix it. But just so you know that there is this is an opinion of the Prima Gadim. So the Prima Gadim says that, well, I'm only being strict if it's a real requirement and not one that I came up with. So if it's one that I argued to do, then you don't have to be strict on it. But if it's on the Gemara, you have to be strict on it. So he himself kind of gives a little leniency on that, but that's not mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch. Now, how does the Mechaber and the Ramah paskin? Well, they say, just like we said, that if meat and cheese touch each other, they're permitted. You have to rinse off the spot. So the Shach, after quoting the Bach, he says that they have to be, at least one of them has to be somewhat wet. But if they're both dry, then there's no requirement. Okay? And so that is the way of understanding the Mechaber, is that when they touch each other, they have to be wet. That's how you would read the Mechaber. So that Basar Gvina Shnag Zebzeh Keshehem Lachim or Keshe Echad Mehen Lachim Mutarim Ela Shtzarach Ladiach Malcolm the Yasan. Right? You have to add those words in. That's how you would read it. All right. So that's one way to understand it. The Prima Gadim and Rabbi Akiva Eiger don't really agree. They say that you would still have to rinse it off, and Rabbi Akiva Eiger also points out that if they're both salted, that you would rinse it off. That you would also rinse it off again. Okay, and also something sharp would also be different. So that's how we paskin in that. So the Ramah, okay, so the Ramah doesn't say anything over here. He says later on in If Beis that he says Davka Sheshbo Lachluches Ktsas. Okay, so even though most of our halacha over here is coming from halacha Aleph, in halacha Beis, where we talk about things that require to be rinsed or whatever, we'll talk more about that. So that's what the Ramah adds in his little state. He says it has to be something that transfers. Okay, if it's super dry, okay, imlo bala hakli rak betzone. If the utensil itself only absorbed flavors through a cold transmission, right? So it was something that was soaking in the kli overnight. Mutter lahaniach bo davar yavesh below hadacha klal. Okay, v'ayin lekaman siman kuf chaf beis. Right, and in the laws of Nosan Talmud Pagam, he'll discuss it in more detail. So the Ramah seems to take the opinion that you could be lenient like the Rashba, even though that may not necessarily be the case of Mechaber. So let's look at that. Okay. So first of all, a couple things. Number one, meat and cheese touching each other is not only limited to meat and cheese; it's also any type of things that would be prohibited. So if you have pork touching kosher steak, okay, same rule. The cold, they touch each other, scrubby. Now, the thing is you have to scrub the pork because pork is treif. We have to scrub the kosher meat, okay? So it's similar, but a little different, meaning you wouldn't wash both of them in the case when it comes in contact with treif, okay? So now it's permitted, okay? So that the thing is that we've described is that maybe you do need to do some scrubbing. You have to worry about the transfer of little particles, and even salt particles should be concerned. So that's something you should be concerned with, even according to the Mechaber as well. Okay, so with the Ramah, we can see that it is lenient. If he is lenient, if they are not somewhat wet. Now, the argument with the Mechaber seems to take that approach as well. And the only other thing that I would add is that if you went ahead and had this thing, okay, like you ate it, okay, or you went ahead and roasted it or cooked it, it doesn't prohibit the food at all. It's just this is a lechatchila prohibition, and if you went ahead and cook it, okay? And so, but if you went ahead and salted it or roasted it, okay, you do need to take off a little bit, because since it touched a little bit, you have to take off a little bit. But with bishul, where everything gets included into, when you cook it, everything gets included into the the amount of shishim, right, which we learn a bit by Kal. So that would be the same in this case as well. Okay, so that's what we see over here. So basically, we learn that the makor for this halacha, the Shulchan Aruch, comes from a Mishnah in Chulin, and it is it is modified ever so slightly by Abaye, and is also a brisa from Psachim that may also influence how we understand it. We assume, generally speaking, that when these things come in contact with each other, that they are going to need to be rinsed off and maybe even scrubbed, and that will depend on if the thing is rather sticky or rather fatty. So use your judgment. And also, if the things become rather attached to it, you want to make sure that it's clean before you go ahead and move on and use it for something else. So even if things are really dry, you need to take a look and see. And the worst thing that comes to worst, you just rinse it off. There's only a shaila if with bread or it doesn't really come off. We mentioned the Mishnah Berurah, who's like, don't fix it on Shabbos. So, something not kosher touched the bread, or you're having bread with a meat meal and then cheese touched it after that meal, there might be an issue. But even the Pri Megadim said, since none of those things are brought up in halacha, you could try to fix the bread even on Shabbos, because you're not really fixing it, because technically the Gemara didn't say it's prohibited. So it's just like a little fun chumrah, and there's ways around it. They're not doing masake, not doing borer, and all of those good things. So the only other thing to point out is that there is a difference between being slightly wet or slightly dry, and it sounds like you could be lenient on it, but the consensus seems to be you should be stringent on it, either because we don't agree with the shach and the bach, or because even dry things leave stuff behind. So you can argue, even if you accept the approach of the shach and the bach, you can still argue that stuff is left on there, and so use your better judgment. So if the stuff on there, rinse it or scrub it, okay? And if you left it on there and you cooked it, that's okay, but you have it. But if you roasted it or you put more salt on it, you'd have to cut off that spot, and we'll talk about klipa in more detail later. And the Ramah has a leniency when if you were using a kli for iser that was only used for cold, so you could put your cold in there, that would be a leniency. And if it was used for something hot and wet, then you couldn't use it for that without rinsing it off. Okay, so but we're gonna come back to those things in more detail. We're going to talk more about if you don't rinse it off in more detail for our next shir. Thank you very much for joining us as we dive deeper and deeper into the rules of Basar B'chalav and talking about cold touching cold, sonen b'tzonein, and we will see you next time.